Okay, I think we're about ready to get going with the next section here. In this component of the independent science review process, what we ask our panel members to do is to kind of give you some preliminary conclusions that they'll kind of over the next month or two iterate into a report on what they think about the quality of the science, things that could be done better, gaps, so on and so forth. And this is kind of a rough draft stage. They have got a lot of new information and take them some time to digest it. Something that's come up in our kind of preliminary discussions is talking about a couple of different uses for data. One is to characterize the conditions at the areas that are potentially affected, and the other one is the kind of data that you would need to move forward with an environmental impact statement, which is kind of the next phase. And so I think the panel members are going to have comments on both stages, although as Pebble has repeatedly told us what they're looking at this data and the way that or the purpose that these studies were designed for was sort of a baseline characteristic, a characterization of site conditions. But the panel members have comments both on the data for that purpose as well as ways to move forward with the next step. I guess I'll start. Maybe, Hal, would you be a good person to go first on this?
But I could try to go first. So I think probably my most important comment is it's been very difficult for us to try to come here and have this conversation because we came first to talk about the data when what we really should have been talking about first is what kind of questions are we going to answer and what sort of estimates do we need in order to help answer those. So since those larger questions weren't really spelled out, I guess it was up to us to sort of imagine what they were or to have our own personal idea of what they were, and that may not be what Pebble had in mind. I saw in yesterday's comments and some of the presentations, there's still, I think, in Pebble some tension between this idea of gathering data for the purpose of characterizing what's there now or what's there pre-mine, and this tension for gathering data for the purpose of monitoring or looking for trends. And this is a good time, I think, to just push the reset button on that. I think we need to put that behind us. I've heard it stated by the mine proponents that the mine is going to have negligible effect on fish, and that may very well be. But I think they need to address what I was calling yesterday an open-minded skeptic about that. I know if I was going to try to make that case, if I was working for Pebble, I know why I would want population-level estimates of adult spawning salmon in the affected areas. Now, maybe Pebble has a different way they're going to try to address that question, but if so, I don't know what it is. And so when I was just sort of using my imagination as to what the big questions were, it seemed to me very important that they have accurate and precise estimates of the spawning escapement. And I know that was also one of their stated objectives, and I think it's important to note that they just missed that objective. But, well, anyway, I'll have more to say about that in a minute. I think another important thing to say is we went through a lot of material, a lot of studies, a lot of work went into this, and so I'm not going to take time to go through and itemize everything that was done right. I think suffice it to say, there was a lot of things that didn't catch our attention because they looked like they were done well. They were done the way you would expect professional biologists to do them, and they're making good progress. Another important point I made yesterday that I think I should go back to, there's a huge, huge inventory of wisdom, science, statistics having to do with Bristol Bay that goes back to the 1800s. And I do think Pebble needs to find ways to take the estimates they're generating and be able to make those compatible with what's already known. And the typical currency that's being used, that has been used since the 1800s, is to express things in adult equivalency, to talk about a number of adults that are harvested, the number of adults that are in the escapement. And I was a little bit lost yesterday in some of the modeling when the modeling is predicting something else. It's predicting something that we can't really observe. So I'd like to recommend that Pebble rethink some of their modeling and to try to have more things that the models are going to predict in units of things that we can actually observe. And I know, for example, in some of the flow work, they're predicting something that really isn't known. And the model still has a lot of value. I'm not trying to just criticize the modeling, but I think there needs to be more things so that you can predict a thing in the world, and then we can look and see if that was a good or bad prediction. I mentioned, so I think it's important to note that we had some missed objectives. We've noted some missed objectives. For example, the objective to estimate the total spawning escapement in adults. And there was some other objectives maybe having to do with food webs. But as I sat and reflected on that, some of those objectives may not be important. And I guess maybe I already said this, I'm just repeating myself, but maybe this is the time to just push the reset button on that and go back and look. Some of those objectives at this time should probably be altered. Maybe some of them should even be deleted. And I guess my last thought is Pebble has some very competent, well-respected scientists working for them. And for the most part, I think they're doing a good job. What I would see as a real success from these couple of days that I've spent here is going forward if the mine opponents and the open-minded skeptics and the mine proponents get to a point where they can all agree on the facts, and those would be the facts that the Pebble's consultants generate. We're not there yet, but I think Pebble needs to maybe make some adjustments too, to realize that we'll all be better off if we're all agreeing on their estimates. We're all using their estimates and then take their estimates and make our own little points with them. And I want to reemphasize that they certainly have respected scientists, that there's no reason why we can't all agree on the facts that they're generating. And that's what I hope will really be the benefit from this couple of days that I've spent here.
Mike? Can you pull the mic forward too?
Oh, thank you. I'll start with the in-stream flow again and aquatic habitat, and echo what Hal mentioned, that we had credible, well-respected people doing some good work. I think they did a good job with what they were charged with. Those studies were, like I mentioned yesterday in the outline, they followed some good protocols. They had good quality control. They presented quite a bit of their work in a transparent manner, so you can go back and look at it. It's not a black box. We've seen that there's work ongoing since 2008 that we were not privy to. We also, from the in-stream flow, for example, I think there's some good usable tools there that were described. The winter aspect is well known. We've talked about that a little bit here. It's hard to gather information in the winter. However, winter is a critical period, so there may need to be something done there. Don't ask me what, because I don't know how to do that, and I certainly won't be up here doing that work for you. The couple of points that I did make yesterday and would continue to emphasize is that the in-stream flow work is dependent on the complex hydrology and fisheries data, and so as that is refined, that needs to feed into the in-stream flow work, which sounds like it's being done. The fact that there were few gauges and they're short term, there needs to be continued work there to determine the flow characteristics of the streams, and I still wonder if it's possible to go back and use some paleo records or something to get a broader perspective on range of flows, even if you do have 68 years or 62 that's not very long. We've seen throughout the country that periods of record are not reflective of what we're likely to see in the future. And finally, to the point of integrating the channel geomorphology and hydrology with the fisheries to get a systems approach to maintain those stream systems, not just focus on the fish, not just focus on one thing, but the whole stream system to maintain that. I think that's important when you come up with some sort of idea of what you're looking for to maintain out there. Going on to the fish a little bit, Hal touched on that, but we see that there's amongst both the consultants, the panelists, and the people who spoke, that there's people aren't all together on what to measure and how to measure the fish, and I think it's worth an effort to get to some agreement on that. If not, then that issue will continue to come up later on. So I think that's something that needs some attention. Hal mentioned what do we need the data for, and that's something I think we all struggled with initially in the reviews. I know I did. I thought I was clear on what the charge was, and then I looked at some documents, and yes, it had that, but here's these other pieces, and then later on we're back to just the environmental baseline to characterize the existing environment. So you can continue to do that for a long time and get input and adjust studies and gather more information, but I'm wondering where that real restricted path takes you. And again, rather than, I think Hal's resetting a button and I'm rescoping objectives or transitioning, that I think the thing people are interested in and where it might take the studies further is some sort of transition or rescope. The objectives were a little different too by different chapters if you read how they were portrayed, at least, to incorporate how we get to assessing risk and impact analysis and monitoring. How do we get to that next phase? Because I think that's where the real interest lies. That will require some sort of an idea of what's going to happen out there on the ground. The work groups are something similar. I'm not sure. It sounded like the in-stream flow work group was productive. Some of the others apparently went away. But some sort of an approach to gather, maybe saying the same thing Hal is with his, what kind of skeptics are those? But to gather folks around and get some common language, denomination of how you're talking about some of these issues, and get agreement on that, and maybe even some of the approaches to collecting information early rather than completing all of that and then trying to get concurrence. So I think that might be worth gathering up some people and giving another shot at that. I think that's all that I had.
Thanks, Mike. Jeep, if you can. Yep, perfect.
A lot of my comments, in a way, are redundant over both what Hal and Mike have said. I'll just kind of think at this from the big picture level. And first, I'm not representing my agency that I've worked for the last 40-plus years. But nevertheless, the activities I've done while working for the National Marine Fisheries Service, first job I had was writing the marine part of the environmental impact statement for the Alyeska Marine Terminal and Transportation Corridor, the Marine Corridor. So that kind of shapes how I've evolved over the years, and then I've been involved in damage assessment studies ranging from Exxon Valdez, the Gulf, Hiroshima, other spills like that. So when I look at this document, I'm first struck with how big it is. It's a large document. There's a lot of good stuff in it. My compliments to many of the authors and whatnot, including John this morning, did a great job, I thought. And where I get to, though, is this, quote, missing part. In other words, I'm thinking about how will this be used to evaluate risk? How will it be used later to evaluate damage assessment after an event may happen? Or how does it change with time? And then that's where I see the missing parts, you know. So what's there is really pretty good, I think, quality-wise, certainly the volume. But, you know, it's not entirely there. I think that to start with, it's got the word baseline in it. And, you know, and then later they clarify, well, we really mean characterization, and they probably should have had characterization in there to start. Environmental characterization study would have been a better name than environmental baseline. Environmental baseline means that we know where the mine's going to be and how big it is and all those sorts of things, and then you start measuring baselines relative to that mine plan. Well, we don't have a mine plan yet, so it's a little bit premature to evaluate risk since you don't know that plan. So really, I think the next evolution is, so what are the gaps, as Cy will say, what are the gaps that we need in order to add on to this in order to be able to evaluate risk and later to be able to evaluate change. So that's kind of the big picture as I see it, that we need the next evolution to go. On a one notch down sort of thing, I view the weak link, so to speak, in terms of the freshwater environment where the fish are. I mean, I'm only thinking about fish right now. I don't care too much about lichens or amphipods or whatever. I'm thinking about fish, I'm sorry. And but for me, it's all about the fish, so to speak, and what it takes to support them, the habitat. But, you know, so first problem is it's the water, you know, and so I want to know what happens to that water in the winter when the weak link in the survival chain for those fish, that's when that is. That's their weak link. They need to come out with enough energy in the spring to survive and whatnot, but what's happening to the water flow, what's happening, are the fish up there in the upper Telluric or whatever, are they up there? Or do they come down as juveniles, juvenile coho, for example, to rear in pools that are much further downstream or something like that. So where are the fish? What's happening in the winter? How much water is there, flow for them? Is it enough to affect a survival for them or not? So I'm really focused on that winter part. That's the early life stages where they're most vulnerable. That's where we can really cause the biggest interruption in their life cycle, I think. And all that so that we can get those big adults to return later. And I think that's all I have. I'll leave it there.
All right, Cy?
As a CC being last, I can just endorse everything my panelists have said. But I'd really like to reinforce what Mike said about sort of this being a critical, or should be a critical point for transition, and might use the marine studies that John presented this morning as an example of really comprehensive and well-conducted studies, 2004 and 2008, that appear to be serving as a foundation for moving forward with greater focus. But I think both for John and for a lot of the presenters, we got an inkling of things that have happened since then and changes and focus without a really sort of good understanding of that focus and the rationale behind it. So, it's obvious there is a transition towards more focus, towards better modeling, filling the gaps, but it's not really very transparent, and it seems like it's a good time for not only to describe where the baseline studies are evolving, but also how is the interpretation of those studies starting to feed the impact and risk assessment. And again, the existing document isn't really heavy on interpretation, but I think we heard some great off-the-cuff interpretations that really point to where risk and impact assessment could go. And I think that really does need to be transparent, and particularly, where are the gaps? There's been, at least in terms of the marine studies, there's a fair amount of concurrence in the gaps. I don't know if John would have added one more slide to that litany of slides, but it would have really helped to have had what are we doing since 2008? What gaps have we identified as the major study group in the marine studies? It would have solved a lot of my questions very rapidly. And I guess one of the other things is the I think need to move forward to treating this much more from a system scale. It still seems fairly fragmented, although again, Dudley Reiser recognized the need to move to connect groundwater to surface water processes. There was a mention of sort of landscape scale fish movements across different habitats and with different life history stages and species. The idea of sort of understanding nearshore habitat use. So it's a time for transitioning to start looking at this as a system and bringing in more of the sort of spatially explicit evolution of the partnerships or plans. And I think that pretty much hits on my additional footnotes.
Okay. Well, so these comments and interpretations are going to evolve into some sort of final report. I'm not quite sure what the timeline is, but probably a couple months is a rough guess. Towards the end of the year. Okay. Well, do you have any concluding thoughts, or it sounds like Charlotte wants to say something?
See if I can remember to identify myself for once. Charlotte McKay with the Pebble Project. Thank you for all your comments. They're very, very helpful. I think the point I just want to reiterate is the transition and the sometimes called lack of transparency of where this is going isn't something we can do until we have a mine plan. And there is a lot of places this will need to go and how this will evolve. But it's difficult to plan that until we have settled on a mine design and a mine plan. And so this is all good information that we'll take into account. But there is ongoing studies and there are gaps we can fill in the meantime that we continue to fill in. But there are certain things we can't do until we actually have a mine plan to focus studies around. Thank you very much for all your help.
John Shively, CEO of Pebble. I'd just like to express my appreciation for the time you've spent. I know this is not an easy exercise. You've given us, I think, some very good advice here. We need to go back and sort through all of this. To me, we are collecting information. The information is important to us as we go to develop a mine plan, and without the information, we couldn't develop a good mine plan, so we're going to use it that way. I do just have to say this, though, about information, and this is sort of my favorite example of why sometimes information isn't as apparent or as some people may think it is in terms of its usefulness, and that's the Central Arctic caribou herd. The Central Arctic caribou herd, when Prudhoe Bay was developed, was 6,000 animals. Today, it's 50 to 60,000 animals. Now, nobody would say that the growth from 6,000 to 60,000 was the result of oil development. It's a result of the natural caribou go up and down. But I'll guarantee you that if it had been 60,000 back in 1978 and was 6,000 today, the drop would be blamed on the oil industries. So we do need to be careful sometimes when we collect this information and there are changes, what causes those changes. And I think that's why there's so much debate about this whole thing about spawners and about escapement, because it is something that the mine itself actually doesn't control.
All right. Well, I think this is probably a good opportunity to thank our panel members for their time spent in the last couple of days and the weeks of wading through a huge amount of material prior to that. Thanks, everybody. And I think we're breaking for lunch. Todd, we're going to try to keep with our schedule for the afternoon, so we're scheduled to get together at 1:15 to start the socioeconomic conditions panel.